Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast, and thank you for being with me today. It's really a blessing that you would take the time to listen to this episode, and I do pray that today's episode will be a blessing and an encouragement to you. And I believe that it will be, because I have a very special guest that I'm excited about. And the way this episode came about is rather spontaneous, to be honest with you. I met this person just very recently, just this past week. And really, he is a person that's been listening to the podcast. He found it, well, I'll find out when he found it. But his name is Caleb Klingen. And Caleb, let me just start by saying hi.
Hey, Tony, how you doing?
Just fine. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm going to read the note that you sent to me, Caleb. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, I get notes and letters from listeners on occasion, and I really appreciate when I do. I invite you guys at any time to let me know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, if you have thoughts, ideas, what you're learning, how God's using the podcast to speak into your heart and life. And if you have any questions or even objections or concerns, I love to hear from our listeners, so feel free to contact me at any time. So the other day I got this note from this guy named Caleb, and here's what the note said. 70 episodes. That's how many episodes it took for me to understand my sexuality as a gift intended for my wife and my wife only. 70 episodes is how long it took for me to build up my courage to confess to my wife how I am addicted to masturbation. Not even pornography, simply the thrill and ecstasy of masturbating. I have struggled with masturbation for 14 years. Through God's grace, I felt convicted after every single time. He never stopped calling me higher. Thank you so much for this ministry. It has truly changed my life and my marriage. So, of course, when I got that note, it was a great blessing, and I appreciated Caleb sending me that note about his heart, his life, even his sexual gift, and what God is doing and how God's used the podcast in his life. And so I sent Caleb a note and just told him thank you and shared a few things. And then at the end, I asked him, hey, would you ever consider being a guest on the Power of Purity podcast? And I get a lot of notes from listeners, but I don't always feel compelled to invite a person to be a guest. And I don't know why. I just was in my heart and my mind, I need to invite Caleb to be a guest if he'd be willing to share his story. And he very graciously agreed to be a guest on the podcast. So thanks for doing that, Caleb.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let me ask, why were you willing to be a guest on the podcast?
It's kind of a crazy feeling and story that I've always had this desire to help other people, in general, help other people. Part of my story is that I'm currently in grad school to become a counselor. Like, I'm trying to study and learn and get licensed as a counselor. And so I have that desire. But then the other side of it was, specifically with sexuality, I've always had this desire to help other people kind of understand their story, to help other people try and change and become a more godly man. But then I've always had this keeping me back of, I haven't overcome it yet. Like, I haven't made it through that yet. And so and I've always had that nagging thought of, well, how can you help other people if you haven't gone through it yet yourself? Like, if you haven't made it through to the other side. And really, especially whenever you offered me this opportunity to be on the podcast, talking about this stuff, I'm still not comfortable with it. I'm still not comfortable telling other people about my struggle and story, but I think that's what God calls us to do. He calls us to community, and the enemy calls us to isolation.
That's
and so
right.
I'm trying to lean into that community.
Wow, that's really good, Caleb. So God is on your radar. You're a believer in Christ.
Absolutely.
And how long have you been a believer?
So I like to tell people since I was in the womb.
Okay.
I was raised in church, but I distinctively remember deciding to follow Christ and giving my life to Him whenever I was 18 years old. I distinctively remember making that decision. Growing up in church, I had really, I'd been around all of it. I'm 28 years old. And being in church, especially through like 9/11, I got to see the church just really grow and expand in a wonderful way. And so I saw all that, but it was I never really bought in, I guess, or I never really decided to fully commit to God. But I made that decision about whenever I was 18.
Do you remember what happened when you were 18? Did you see something different, understand something different? It feels like, in a way, as they say, the longest 18 inches in the world from your head to your heart.
Yeah.
It feels like you grew up in church and you knew about God and Jesus maybe cognitively, but something shifted when you were 18 and it moved, like it invaded your heart or something.
I think the one experience that really led to me making that decision was the story of my life because of a girl. I was dating a girl at the time I started dating her before I graduated, and then we continued on into the summer after I graduated high school. And she had broken up with me literally on the first night of a mission trip. and I'm with her and her church on this mission trip. And very first night we get there, I'm in Pennsylvania. We were in Pennsylvania. And sure enough, she breaks up with me. And I'm like, well, great. Now I'm here with this church I don't know, with my ex-girlfriend now.
Wow.
And during that week of that mission trip, having the opportunity to go out and serve others, to try and share the gospel, there was a moment that I distinctly remember where I felt like God was saying, hang back today. Don't go be with everybody else. Just spend some time in worship with me. And so that's part of my story as well, that I'm currently a worship leader. I've been playing guitar since I was in 9th grade. And I've learned a bunch of different instruments and stuff. And so whenever I'm 18, I had this distinct calling, like, just spend the moment with me. And so I go into this room while I'm on this mission trip, and I start playing Revelation song. I started playing that on my guitar, and I started singing it. And then it quickly went from singing that to just singing anything that came in my mind and singing. I spent 2 hours just singing everything and
wow,
giving my heart to God in that moment. And from then on, that's where I can distinctly say, yeah, that's whenever I really started to take my faith seriously.
Wow. Would you say that somehow God became more real to you in that moment than He had ever been, or you had a closer connection with Him? Something happened.
Yeah. Well, it felt like it became more personal. Mm-hmm. It felt like it felt like God had actually invaded my heart in that moment.
Praise God. I think that happened for me when I was 16 years old. I understood the gospel for the first time. I grew up Catholic. I'm 100% Sicilian, so most Italian families are Catholic, So I grew up in the church, but I never liked going to church. I remember when I was a kid, my mom used to say she wanted me to grow up and be a priest. I was going to be her priest. And I thought, holy cow, I don't even like to go to church for 1 hour, let alone go every day and devote my life to it.
Yeah.
But when I was 16 and I understood the gospel for the first time in my life, who Jesus was and what He had done for me through His death, burial, and resurrection, I don't know, I had this aha moment. The light bulb went on. The veil fell from my spiritual eyes and heart, and I could see Christ. And for me, it answered all the big questions of life, even though I was only 16 years old. How did the universe get here? How did we get here?
Yeah.
What is the purpose of life? What's worth living for? What's worth dying for? What happens to us after we die? What gives meaning and purpose to life? It's like Jesus answered all the big questions. So I just embraced Christ. I opened my heart to Christ. And I just intuitively knew this explains my life. The rest of my life, I'm just going to serve God. That's all that matters. Yeah. So I found the Lord when I was 16. It sounds like you really found Him when you were 18. So praise be to God.
Amen.
And you just mentioned, by the way, you're a worship leader. So you lead worship at your church, your local church?
Yes, sir. So The church I go to, we have two services. We have a traditional service and a contemporary, and I lead the contemporary service. I'm in charge of operating that team, leading the services, and doing that kind of thing.
Wow, that sounds totally awesome. And you've been playing guitar since you were in ninth grade.
Ninth grade, yes, sir.
I can only imagine you have a gift of music. God's put a gifting in you of instrument, of voice, and I think it's totally awesome that you're willing to use that for the Lord, Caleb.
I remember once again distinctly hearing God nudge me in a certain direction was whenever I was 18, a few months after that event I just told you all about. I had gone to college and I was attending a night of worship on campus, and I just remember so distinctly sitting there, and it was like God whispered to me and said, "Caleb, you can play guitar for me." And it was after that I got involved with my church. I tried to get on the worship team, and at the time, I was playing like Guns N' Roses and Metallica riffs on my guitar, but they were like, "Well, here's Hillsong, and why don't you just play what they play?"
Awesome. That's really awesome. So you've been using your gift to serve God, and I have no doubt that it's a blessing to Him, to God's heart, and you're using your gift for God's kingdom, and it's a blessing to God's people. I think it's really beautiful in your story that it's while you were worshiping God, singing to God, that He invaded your heart and called you, in a sense, He wooed you to Himself through worship.
Yeah. It really kind of set the tone for ever since then as well.
Do you write songs?
I do. I don't even know the number count. I write them just as they come.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then and there was a time where I really wanted to make it big as a recording artist, guitarist, whatever you want to call it. Part of my story, I was telling you beforehand, part of my story is that I got to play guitar in a band called We Are Messengers. They have all sorts of songs on Caleb and Air One, and got to tour the country for about a year and a half that I was with the band.
How awesome is that? That must have been like a dream come true.
It was in a lot of ways, but it was also, to the fullest extent of that saying, it was my dream came true, and it kind of settled that nudge of what if. So I didn't have to worry anymore about, well, what would life have been like if I had tried to make it big in music? It kind of fulfilled that and said, oh, that's what it's like. Okay, I'd rather just stay home.
Okay, a year and a half was enough, huh? A year and a half of the road.
Yeah. Well, and it really showed me so many things. One of the chief things, so I actually left the band probably about 2 months before I proposed to my wife. And I had seen just so many different Christian artists that I got to meet, so many that we toured with, watching them be separated from their families. That was kind of one of those things for me. I was like, it's such an honorable sacrifice that they're making for the ministry of spreading the gospel. I just don't know if that's a sacrifice that I A, feel called to make, and B, want to make.
I understand. Yeah, it's a huge sacrifice.
Yeah.
The notoriety, I can only imagine the notoriety of having a significant platform, being on the stage, in a sense, being in the limelight. I don't know how big the crowds were. How big a crowds would you guys play for?
Well, we played from everything from like 30 people to I think the most that I remember was around 10 to 11,000, somewhere in there. And I know that they've gone on and played more than that now, but that was just with the time I was with them.
Wow. So that's a little bit intoxicating and romantic, the notion of being with a big band and traveling around the country and doing these concerts and having some level of notoriety. It could be kind of intoxicating, probably especially for a young guy.
Well, to quote the infamous poets of Nickelback, we all just want to be rock stars. So, but yeah, it was definitely intoxicating, and there was a lot of my story that we can dive into with that. But it was definitely, like I said, it was like every kid's dream come true. I mean, every kid that sits in their room, like I started playing guitar because of Guitar Hero. I got to where, if there's any listeners that have played Guitar Hero, I got to where I could play Through the Fire and Flames, which is like one of the hardest songs ever. I could play it on Expert and I could pass it, and I was like, all right, real guitar can't be that much harder. Well, I haven't touched Guitar Hero since, and I'm nowhere near being able to play Through the Fire and the Flames. So.
Wow.
But to go from that to being on stage, to rocking out with a band, it was awesome. It was a dream come true, and I'm incredibly grateful to God for the experiences He gave me through
Praise
that.
God. So maybe we'll get back to that. I'm fascinated and would like to hear a little bit more about that. But toward the purpose of this episode today, the power of purity, you shared in the note that you sent to me that you've struggled with masturbation for 14 years, even more than pornography.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned a few minutes ago that you're 28 years old now.
Yes, sir.
How long have you been married, Caleb?
So we got married in 2018. So this will be 2 years.
Married 2 years. So you were 26 when you got married.
Yes, sir.
Coincidentally, I was 26 years old when I got married.
Oh, no way.
So coincidentally, I guess doing the math, you started masturbating about at the age of 14. I guess you discovered this, it became a habit, which is half of your life. You're 28 now, you've been masturbating 14 years.
Yeah.
So this is something that you've struggled with for years and years and years, which I would advocate, by the way. I don't think you're a freak show at all. I think the fact is that every young boy goes through puberty. Our bodies are in this transition from being a boy to becoming a man, and our bodies begin to make testosterone, and we go through this metamorphosis. Our body is literally changing. You begin to get facial hair, hair under your armpits, hair in the pubic area, and your voice is beginning to change, and a lot of boys get pimples, and you begin to have sexual thoughts and feelings, and you begin to notice other people sexually. So no doubt you're going through this, and about this time, most young boys discover their penis in a new and different way. I remember when I was a kid, I could touch myself and it would feel good. I knew intuitively I liked to derive pleasurable feelings by touching myself down there. But then when I discovered masturbation and orgasm, and then I discovered, holy cow, this unbelievably wonderful, amazing, ecstatic, overwhelming sensation that I could create by doing this, by having an orgasm. Then I discovered I could replicate this feeling over and over again, as many times as I wanted to. It's like something that quickly becomes addictive for, I would advocate for most young men, you know. And so most young men then fall into what I call a rhythm of masturbation, or a sexual rhythm with their own body. You get in this relationship with your sexual self. Really, you get, you know, maybe it's a weird way to say it, but you get in a relationship with your penis and with your orgasm. And for me, I think my penis became my best friend, you know, and it's something that I did. I'm a therapist now, and I work with a lot of young men, and I've worked with young men who have struggles with masturbation, like compulsive masturbation. I was never like that, but it wasn't unusual for me once I discovered it. I would masturbate every day, once a day, or every couple days at least. I mean, it wasn't a benign event for me. It wasn't like I discovered it and then I forgot about it for 3 months. And then 3 months later, I remember, oh yeah, that thing, I remember that. Maybe I'll do that again. It wasn't like that. It wasn't a little deal. It was a big deal. So how would you put words to it for you, Caleb? How did it go when you discovered this? You say it became a habit beginning at the age of 14.
Yeah. For sure. What's something that has always stuck with me as well is, 14 is whenever around about the time that it started for me, which was also the exact same time that I started playing guitar. It was the same year that I started playing guitar.
Wow.
Was whenever I started that addiction. And, and that's something we can get into later, but essentially I felt like the more and more I did for God using worship, the more that seemed to attack me and follow me as well. But we can dive into that in a bit.
Well, if you want to comment on it, go ahead. I mean, how do you make sense of that? What was that all about?
I really, especially looking back on it now, I really felt like and believed that it was the enemy. The more that I was doing for the glory of God and trying to advance His kingdom, the more the enemy was trying to attack me with those things that he knew would get me. And and we get stuck in that shame cycle. We get stuck in that feeling like, well, you've already done it this week. Why not do it again?
Right.
And so it really felt like, so even, I shared earlier about with me being in the band. I remember there were so many times on the tour bus where we would have, I would literally have conversations with people after our shows about them giving their lives to Christ. We're seeing the gospel spread and people coming to know Christ. And I'd be having these spiritual highs, and then I go to the bus and going right to my phone and looking at porn. Mm-hmm. And it felt like such a incongruent thing that was happening within me, and it really just created this huge amount of shame for me, especially while I was in the band, because we're seeing this great work of God, but then I'm coming back and doing that. And I remember at the time I had read a post by Mike Donahue of 10th Avenue North. He talks about having, he's lead singer of 10th Avenue North. He talks about having a porn clock. And what he means is that he has, instead of keeping his phone in the bunk with him, he puts it out in the front of the bus, and he has an actual physical alarm clock so that he doesn't have to even worry about that temptation once he gets in there. I remember reading that, feeling convicted about it, and I never tried it because I convinced myself that I have to have my phone on me. I have to keep my phone on me in case somebody calls or needs me. I need it for the alarm, all of that. And there was just such a cycle of shame that happened with that.
Wow, that's very powerful, Caleb. So this goes on beginning at the age of 14. Do you remember what this young boy, 14, 15, 16, what it provoked in him? You speak of shame. I've used the metaphor before of a bulldozer. Sexuality is unbelievably powerful. And if you took an 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old boy and put him on a bulldozer and unleashed him, what would he do? He's on this incredible thing that has unbelievable power. I mean, a bulldozer is so powerful, you can literally drive it right through a house. You could knock down a whole house. You could knock down huge trees. This powerful thing. The point being, a young boy is nowhere near equipped. He doesn't have the orientation to handle or manage something so incredibly powerful. And I think when boys discover this, it becomes so powerful. I mean, I believe for me, my sexual addiction it might have began when I was 10 years old. I found my dad's porn when I was 10. And I was compelled by it. Once I found it, I could not resist going to look at it again and again. I've said before, I feel like there was a silent voice. It wasn't audible, but I could hear this thing calling me, these magazines and books. They had a voice, and I could hear them saying, "Tony, we're waiting for you. We're here. Come on, come and look. You want to look. We have these colorful pictures. We're waiting." I could hear this thing calling me and pulling me like a magnet. So it's unbelievably powerful. And I don't think the average boy has the ability to control this thing or to manage it. It's unbelievably difficult. So do you have a sense of what this young 14, 15-year-old kid, how was this affecting him?
For sure. So I actually remember distinctively my first time that I had acted out, that I had masturbated. And I think it kind of set the tone for the next few years as well, because my very first time was actually while playing a video game. I was playing this WWE wrestling video game, and we had the closest thing to porn in my life at the time was these scantily clad dressed women that the game had that you could play as. And I remember I'm playing this game, and it feels like such a innocent thing to say and talk about, but I'm literally just playing the game. It feels good. I start playing with myself, and then all of a sudden I've arrived. And it's one of those things where at the time I intuitively knew I think I knew that wasn't okay. And I knew enough of that to know that I didn't need to tell anyone about it. Like I instinctively knew this is not something that I should go tell mom and dad, but I didn't necessarily have shame either. But it just felt so good. And it literally set the course for the next 14 years because it really has become a thing where masturbation just felt so good that I wanted to keep having that feeling.
Right. I understand completely. I think most guys listening right now can relate to what you're saying because it might not have been exactly the same for all of us. Of course, most guys probably weren't playing a video game at the time, but we all had that first experience, those first few experiences, that discovery, and we found our way into this thing, and we had that experience, and it was powerful, and we were attracted to it, and it like dug its claws into our soul and began to own us.
Yeah.
You speak of not wanting to tell your parents, of course. Do you remember, did you have a sense of what to expect, or did you even know what an orgasm was before it happened? Had you ever heard of that? Did anybody ever have a talk with you or anything like that?
So it's kind of the weird thing of my story. I don't know, and I don't know what it is, but I actively tried to avoid those conversations as much as I could.
I think most boys do, probably just out of embarrassment, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean to the point of like when I remember distinctly in 5th grade, there was a day where we were supposed to go, like all the guys would go into a room and watch this video at school, all the girls were going into another room. And I remember just I don't even remember why I had such embarrassment about it, but I had my parents sign a note so I wouldn't even go watch the video. I was just kind of so embarrassed by it, and I don't even remember why. But then, so going to fast forwarding to when I was in 9th grade, I heard all of my friends talk about it, and this is something I've heard y'all talk about all the time on the show is, like if we don't learn about this from our parents, if we don't learn about it from our church, you're going to learn about it from your friends.
Right, from MTV, from movies, from porn.
Yeah. And my experience with my friends is they were all talking about it. They would make jokes about masturbating all the time. So the extent of my knowledge really came from my friend base. And I just remember after the event, I just remember thinking, that's masturbation. That's got to be what everybody's talking about. Because that felt amazing.
Wow. So finally, the light bulb went off and you knew what your buddies were talking about.
Yeah.
Up till that point, you probably weren't even quite sure what they were talking about and probably felt embarrassed to ask, like, holy cow, I'm like the odd man out here.
Yeah, you just make jokes thinking you know what you're talking about.
Right. I remember when I was a boy, and I'm sure most of the listeners have heard my story. I share my story in the early episodes of the podcast. I did not have an orientation. I remember I grew up Catholic, and we went to religion school, Catholic school, every Saturday morning, religion class. And at some point, they showed a sex film at the Catholic church, and all the kids went. So I remember that, but I don't remember having any frame of reference what an orgasm is or what ejaculating is. I didn't expect that. I didn't know that. So the first time that I ejaculated, I literally thought that I had broken my body.
Yeah.
This stuff came out of me. And I don't know what this kid was thinking, but the only thing I can imagine is that it's like, I think I must have been thinking, like, if you cut yourself, blood comes out of you. Something comes out of you. It means, dude, you're broke. Something's wrong. So I thought I broke myself. I hurt myself, and I wanted to run to my mom and say, Mom, something happened. Something came out. But I must have had this intuitive sense of shame because although I wanted to tell my mom, I didn't know, do I need to go to the hospital? But I couldn't tell her because I intuitively knew she would ask, well, what were you doing? How did this happen? I was going to have to try to explain it. I had this intuitive sense of shame. So I did not tell my mother. But the punchline of the story for me, and I really realized this when I was in my own therapeutic process, was that I continued to masturbate and to ejaculate once I found this experience. It was so powerful. I wanted to feel it again and again and again, even though I literally thought I was harming myself. I was hurting my body. I couldn't resist not doing it, even though I thought I was harming myself. And to me, that shows how powerful it was and what might have been the seeds of my addiction.
Yeah.
I was already being compelled by sex. I was being compelled by my orgasm. It was controlling me. It was assuming authority over my soul already, bossing me around. When I was scared and I thought, I shouldn't do this, I'm harming myself, and yet I couldn't resist not doing it.
Wow. And that's such a powerful story.
It speaks of how powerful it is for these boys.
Yeah.
So this begins when you're 14 years old, the same year that you began playing guitar and learning to worship. And then this goes on for some period of years after that. You enter into an authentic relationship with Christ when you're 18 years old. How did that affect this habit, Caleb? When you got into a deeper connection with God, did you think God would take it away? Did you think something would change? I
can definitively say that that's when I really started to feel shame, because I knew that was not the standard of living that Christ has called us to. But even in that shame, like that was the tipping point, really, because I really developed an addiction to porn. I had said in my initial message as well that masturbation is the thing that I was addicted to, and it really was the thing that I enjoyed the most. But especially whenever I got to college, I had free reign to look at the internet and look at whatever I wanted to, and I got so addicted to the actual looking at porn. Like I would be so addicted to trying to find all the videos that I wanted to see. I would be looking daily to see if there's any new videos posted. You're always in search of that perfect video.
Right.
And that 14 years later, I still haven't found that perfect video, and that relationship with Christ, whenever I started that in 18, it really introduced shame for me. And at the time, I didn't know enough theologically to understand what Christ actually did for me on the cross. I didn't understand fully at that time. I just knew that I was in the wrong, but I didn't know how to stop.
Mm-hmm. Wow. How would you put words to that, what Christ has done for you? How would you put words to that now? What did you eventually come to understand about Jesus and what he had done for you?
I think the way that I would put words to it is, for the longest time, I had a problem with understanding that Christ. So, I had no problem believing, Christ has forgiven me for my past sins. I loosely believed, my present sins are not great, but Christ has given me forgiveness now. I had no way of understanding that Christ had already paid for my future sins as well. That all of my sins were future sins whenever Christ died on the cross and rose again. And understanding that concept and realizing that literally there's nothing I can do to surprise God. That every single thing I'm going to do in my life, every sin, every failure, Christ knew all of that when he went to the cross already. There's no surprising him. There's no shocks. And he knew all that, and he still went there and died for me.
Praise God. So God loved you, even though you were a young man with this struggle.
Yeah.
Jesus still loved you. Jesus still died for your sins. You were still a son of God. So maybe you didn't really understand the gospel. You didn't understand the forgiveness of God, the grace of God. And it's that grace that empowers us to change.
Yeah.
Well, Caleb, I see from the clock that we're out of time for today's episode, so I would like to invite you to come back next week for our next episode. I'm fascinated by your story, and I've got a number of other questions for you. So, Caleb, would you be able to come back to continue this fascinating discussion next week?
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
And I have an idea. I've never done this before, and I don't know if it's a good idea, so I give you the right to plead the fifth. Okay? next week when we come back, is your guitar close to you right now?
It is.
What if I invite you to play a song for us, a worship song?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, awesome. Good. I'll love it. I'll look forward to that. So guys, if you want to hear more of Caleb's story, and if you want to hear Caleb's gift of instrument and voice, he's going to sing for us next week. So come back right here to the Power of Purity podcast, where we will continue this discussion with Caleb Klingon, and we will be blessed. So in Jesus' name, I bless you guys. Have an awesome week. Have an awesome day. Be blessed as you go forward in your walk with God. And we'll see you right back here next week. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.